Hello. So I got myself quite excited by my new YouTube venture and then promptly spent, I don't know, a month maybe not reading a single book. So there goes business books and babies for a month. But the good news is that it's back. I have read Deep Work by Newport, and that's the book that I am here to talk to you about today. So maybe it's a little bit ironic that it was the book Deep Work that kind of caught me out and got me stuck and stopped me in my tracks with this little video series experiment that I'm doing. Or maybe not, because the reason why I haven't been reading is because I've been focusing on finishing my own book, It's Time to Do Law Differently, which has now been printed, so it's almost ready for publication. I'm just waiting for the books to be shipped across the country to me, and then it'll be ready to be published in mid-November. So I guess I've been focused on my own deep work, which is what has stopped me from reading books just like Deep Work. So let's talk about this book. I've got some notes down here on my laptop, so when you see me looking here, that's what's going on. So Deep Work by Cal Newport is about rules for focused success in a distracted world. Now, I have read this book over the last couple of weeks. I did start it probably about a month ago, and I found it really quite difficult to get stuck into. I don't know if that was in part because I had a lot going on in my own world, so I wasn't really prioritizing the time for reading, or maybe if it was just a bit of a challenge to get into. I spoke to somebody else who was reading this book, and she said the same thing, that she'd also found it quite hard to get stuck into, so perhaps it's that. Deep work is defined as, I've copied it down here, professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive abilities to their limit. These efforts create new value, improve your skill, and are hard to replicate. So that's what deep work is all about. And really the idea is that highly focused and concentrated deep work can produce a huge output. And the book goes to lengths to talk about the fact that we don't need to be in deep work all the time, but that those concentrated times of deep work, when we really apply ourselves properly, those can produce amazing results. So the book is broken into two parts. Part one is called The Idea. Let me find the intro. Part one is called The Idea, and that's really about what is deep work, and it goes into deep work is valuable, rare and meaningful, tells us all about what it is and why we should be doing it. And then part two is the rules, and the rules for deep work are to work deeply, embrace boredom, quit social media, and drain the shallows. Now, I found part two much more engaging for me than part one. I guess I didn't really need to be convinced that deep work was a good thing. I do already, in the way I structure my work, make sure that I allocate time for deep work. I'm probably going to do it in a different way as a result of reading this book, but I already know that it's valuable and that it's important, and that I need to be consciously thinking about making time for that work distraction free. But maybe also it's because I'm a really practical person. Part two is all about the how. This is how to do it, what you need to do to make it happen, which I just connect with a lot more than kind of the theoretical stuff. Now, I accept that the theoretical stuff is important. It's kind of the foundations, but you know, just go with me. Okay, so what I have got in these notes are some takeaways from really mainly part two, those 4 rules, and I thought I would give you a quick summary of what those 4 rules are and give you some reflections as we go in terms of what I've thought about as I've read the book and the things that I might now do differently as a result of what I have learned. So the rules for deep work. Rule 1 is to work deeply, and this is all about replacing distraction with focus, which is, you know, probably pretty clear from the title and the subtitle of the book. As I mentioned before, Cal Newport talks about deep work and says that we don't need every single hour of our work to be deep work, but we need to find a way to integrate deep work into our lives. So the book offers lots of different ways to do that. It gives you strategies for cutting out distractions so that you can focus your time, or for scheduling short periods of deep work, and again they have lots of different examples of the ways in which that can be done. One of the examples in the book is a professor who crams all his teaching into the first semester and is available to his students and does his teaching during semester 1, and then on semester 2 he basically shuts himself away to do his research and his other projects. So he's kind of split his year into half, and the first half is the teaching work and the second half is the deep work. But there are lots of stories and examples of different ways that different professionals have tackled this idea. There was a lot of focus in this rule 1, about having a place to work deeply. And that was interesting for me. I do find that I work best in terms of my deep work when I'm in a familiar surrounding. So I have obviously my office in the office, or at home. I also have a home office, but I really prefer to work from the kitchen table, which doesn't really satisfy the deep work people who tell me not to work distracted. But it is really, really clear to me that I need to work in a familiar place, especially when I'm trying to do deep work. For me, if I go somewhere brand new, like a cafe, or today I'm working from my parents' house because my kids are at home, and they will definitely distract me, it takes me a while to get into the swing of things. I kind of have to get comfortable with my surroundings. So the idea of having a dedicated place to work deeply was interesting to me, but also because they talk about having a nice place. So there's examples of people who have a retreat in the forest where they go to do their deep work, which sounds lovely, and it's not something that I have. But it did get me thinking about how I can improve where I work. Maybe I could, deck out the home office in a new way, or put some more thought into the space that I work to kind of encourage and inspire different ways of thinking. So there's some thoughts there for me to work on. There's one section in Rule 1 called Execute Like a Business, and this is the part of the whole book that I resonated with the most. And I'm going to talk to you about it probably for longer than the rest of the book. But the idea is from Harvard Business School Professor Clayton Christensen, whose work I am a very big fan of. And this particular idea is about the distinction between why and how. So having read that far already, when I came across this in the book, I already knew that I was going to be interested in this, because that is something that I focus on a lot in the work I do, particularly with my podcast, Doing Law Differently, and in my new book, It's Time to Do Law Differently, talking about not just why we need to do things differently, but how do we actually go and do it. And to that point, Christensen talks about what he calls the 4 disciplines of execution that help companies to implement their strategy. And those 4 points are: 1, focus on the wildly important; 2, act on the lead measures; 3, keep a compelling scoreboard; and 4, create a cadence of accountability. Now let me tell you really quickly what each of these are, because I found them really, really useful and interesting. So first, focus on the wildly important. The point here, or at least the point that Newport, he takes these disciplines and he applies them to deep work, whereas Christensen created them for companies in the context of them implementing strategy. So it's kind of the adaptation of that, or Newport's adaptation of Christensen's work. But point 1, focus on the wildly important, is that it's not enough to just decide to spend more time working deeply. We actually have to think about, what is it that we want to achieve? What's the goal? The quote I've got written out here: for an individual focused on deep work, the implication is that you should identify a small number of ambitious outcomes to pursue with your deep work hours. The general exhortation to spend more time working deeply doesn't spark a lot of enthusiasm. And I guess the reason why I like this is because it's saying, okay, so deep work is important, but you can't just say, okay, I'm going to work deeply. You really need to know what you're going to focus your time on. Which sounds obvious, but I too have fallen into the trap of saying, I'm going to get up early tomorrow to really get some stuff done, but not actually thought about what that stuff is that I am going to get done, and find that time then just becomes wasted. Incidentally, the next book, the book that I have just started reading, it's actually on a somewhat of a similar topic, but it's Essentialism by Greg McKeown, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. And I'm only a couple of pages into this book, but it has started by talking about this same idea, the idea that if we focus our attention on lots of different things, we can make millimeters of progress in lots of different directions. Whereas if we focus on just one thing, we can make a whole lot more progress towards that goal. And this is basically the same concept. The second discipline from Christensen is to act on the lead measures. This is one that I found really interesting. He says that we need to measure success by the input, not the output, which is somewhat ironic as I say that out loud, because I am forever saying that we should reward people's work and performance based on what they achieve, not what they put in. So this is really saying the opposite of that. And particularly for lawyers, sounds to be saying, I care more about your time than I do about what you achieve with it, which is not what I believe in. But just hear me out on the way that this is described here. So Christensen says that if we measure lag measures, we're always measuring something that is historical and that we can't change. The example that Cal applies in this book is in terms of customer satisfaction. So he says, if you are trying to improve customer satisfaction, the relevant lag measure is your customer satisfaction score. Makes sense? The problem with that though is that when you measure it, the performance that led to that score has already occurred and it can't be changed. Instead, he says we should measure lead measures, which measure the behaviours that drive the success on the lag measure. So the example, to take that further, the lead measure in the customer satisfaction example would be, in this instance, the number of customers who received free samples in a bakery, for example, which was the example given here. Cal goes on to say, for an individual focused on deep work, it's easy to identify the relevant lead measure, time spent in a state of deep work dedicated towards your wildly important goal. So instead of tracking, instead of tracking papers published, instead he tracked the time spent in deep work, and that tally became directly relevant to the work that he did day to day, because he only planned to publish 5 papers each year, or in this particular year. And working towards those 5 things, it's really hard to see progress. I saw this myself when I was writing my manuscript for my book. When I was doing the writing, the getting the words down part, I could see every day how many words I had written, and it was really easy to measure my progress. I could see, today I've written 2,000 words and yesterday I'd only written 200, but I could see the number ticking over, and so it was really easy to track. I felt really motivated. But then when I finished and I got into the editing phase, things became quite different, because I was no longer able to see visually a representation of my progress. And I stalled, and I took a couple of weeks where I did nothing, and when I kind of got my laptop out to do some editing, I was, not really feeling it, not really into it. And I wonder now if perhaps, and maybe I'll try this experiment next time, of measuring my hours spent in deep work as opposed to measuring the word count, because that way that measurement could have continued on into the editing and the other phases too. So that was interesting. Like I said, I don't see this principle as being the same as track the hours you spend at work so that we can measure and reward your performance based on how much you bill your clients, but it is interesting in terms of how much time are you spending in deep work, and record that. Of course, deep work doesn't have to be client or billable work either. To the lawyers, obviously, I'm speaking. Okay, number 3, let's keep moving, is keep a compelling scoreboard. Don't just track your lead measures, actually have them visually out in front of you on display in the workspace so that you can see your progress and your team can see your progress. It's not a radical idea. I know that's something that a lot of people do, but I can definitely see the value in that. And number 4, create a cadence of accountability. And the point here is that teams in particular should meet regularly to talk about the goal, the wildly important goal from step 1. Review their scoreboard that you've got measured up in front of you, and commit to actions to improve the score and review the commitments they made last meeting. Interestingly, this is a technique or a strategy that I've implemented this year in our law firm. In all honesty, just with one of the practice areas. I had intended to do it with all of the practice areas, but I have only been consistent with keeping this meeting going with one of them. But what we do is once a fortnight we meet. As a team, we've set 3 KPIs for the year, and once a fortnight we meet to measure our performance. So how are we tracking towards meeting this KPI? Did we do the things we said we would do last fortnight, and what are the things we're going to do this fortnight to help push us towards our goals? And that's been a really, really valuable and worthwhile exercise to be doing with the team. And it really helps us to keep on top of these KPIs and not let it be a once a year conversation that we have about the things we're going to do that we then don't look at again until, a few weeks before the year is up to kind of check in, did we actually get that done? So that's been a really, really worthwhile exercise. So those are the 4 disciplines that I thought, 4 disciplines of execution from Clayton Christensen that Cal Newport applies in this book, Deep Work. And I thought they were really, really interesting, and I'm going to go and do a bit more research on those, in particular from Christensen, to get some more understanding of the context in which he spoke about these things. But I did really like those, and I really they stopped me and got me thinking about how I could adjust what I do to do some more of that. Okay, let me tell you the other rules for deep work, almost towards the end. So rule 2 is embrace boredom. To really excel at deep work, Cal says we need to embrace boredom. Don't take breaks from distraction, instead take breaks from focus. And the quote I've got written here, efforts to deepen your focus will struggle if you don't simultaneously wean your mind from a dependence on distraction. Much in the same way that athletes must take care of their bodies outside of training sessions, you'll struggle to achieve the deepest levels of concentration if you spend the rest of your time feeling the slightest hint of boredom. So, embrace boredom is really the key message, and I guess that's pretty clear from the heading there. Embrace boredom. I don't think I have much more to say about that. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Rule number 3, quit social media. Now, this rule is just as it sounds, quit. And Cal really doesn't make any apologies for being really quite direct and straightforward, and in some cases pretty harsh in this chapter. And really offers very little sympathy for excuses that we use for why we might continue with our social media use, like it's entertaining or we get to keep in touch with our friends. But the point he makes is that deep work requires us to be free from distraction. So rather than using social media by default because it's almost a habit to pick up our phone and go scrolling, instead to apply what he calls a craftsman approach to tool selection, which encourages us to use social media that aids in the creation of our craft. I've got the quote here, which is the definition of the craftsman approach to tool selection, and that is to identify the core factors that determine success and happiness in your professional and personal life. Adopt a tool only if its positive impacts on these factors substantially outweigh its negative impacts. I think this is one that a lot of people would struggle with, because I think the reality is that we don't perceive the negative impacts of social media, or maybe we are blind to them, or we just ignore them, or we don't want to know about them. So it's an interesting concept. I use social media for my work. I use LinkedIn a lot. I use Facebook to connect particularly with other professionals. There are a lot of groups that I'm a member of that I really like the community that they kind of bring, and those exist on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I kind of post on there because I feel like I should, or I might want to share a photo now and then. But if I wanted to quit social media, that would probably be the first one that I would think about quitting. It's an interesting concept. I'm not about to quit social media. But I do think it's important to consider how we use it and what we're using it for. And one of the comments made in the book was about why are you posting and avoiding posting just kind of shallow content just for the sake of being online. So that was interesting. Okay, and rule number 4, drain the shallows. And this rule is about an acknowledgement that not all the work we do should be deep work. And I touched on this at the very beginning of this video. So we also need to drain the shallows, which is shallow work I call busy work. Things like checking emails, the kind of thing, admin type work that's needed for most of our jobs. But the idea is that we should drain the shallows, but taming shallow work's footprint in your schedule, not eliminating it. So we can't get rid of it completely. Most of us need email in our day-to-day work, but it's about how we use it and reducing our use so that we can free up our time for other things. So a quote, I'm asking you to treat shallow work with suspicion because its damage is often vastly underestimated and its importance vastly overestimated. This type of work is inevitable, but you must keep it confined to a point where it doesn't impede your ability to take full advantage of the deeper efforts that ultimately determine your impact. There were some really interesting examples given in this book. People who refuse to use email completely because they say it distracts me from the really valuable work, and the best thing I can contribute to this world is, whatever, this area of deep thinking, and email distracts me from that, so I'm not going to use it at all. But there were some other more practical, more realistic perhaps examples, including how to schedule your time, time blocking, making sure you've allocated every minute of your day, because we underestimate how long things take us, so really limiting the amount of time we give ourselves to do that kind of stuff. Quantify the depth of your activities, know how much of your work is deep work and what is shallow. And you can then, when you can then schedule your work around your peak performance times. So I, for example, work really best in the morning. So if I know what work I do is deep work and what work is shallow work, I can schedule that deep work for the morning when I'm at my peak, and the shallow work, later into the day when I've started to get tired and I'm not performing at my best. Other examples, becoming hard to reach, making sure you've got a set finish time for your work day. There were some really useful strategies in there, especially for people who have trouble switching off from work. So I would recommend having a read of that if that's you, if you feel like your emails and your phone calls and all that kind of thing tend to consume your life. So there was a lot of comments from me there on part 2, the rules for working deeply, and particularly on that Christensen disciplines for execution that I really did like, and you can tell I liked it because when I write, I highlight, draw, scribble in my books. That's why I like to have the hard copy, so when I go back to them next time I can easily find my pages. So I'm one of those people, I dog ear, but if it's something I really love, I fold the page in half so that it's really easy for me to find again, and that's the page that is folded in half. For me, it's the Christensen disciplines of execution. Even with highlighter, I usually just use pencil, but didn't have one. Anyway, that's the book, Deep Work. What am I going to do? My takeaways, my action items. I'm going to try, I think, to start counting and physically recording the time I spend in deep work. I have a feel for it. I mean, this week, for example, I've probably spent an hour. I'm recording this on a Friday morning, and I've probably spent about an hour in deep work this week. I've been really focused on kind of client work and getting stuff out the door. And I hate it. Every day when I finish work, I feel like I haven't achieved anything because I haven't made any progress towards the bigger goals. It's not to say that the work I've done isn't important, it's just that I feel an imbalance. So I might start counting and physically recording the time that I spend in deep work and see kind of how that makes a difference for me. I'm definitely going to do some research on those disciplines of execution. I think that sounds like a really interesting concept that I would like to learn some more about. I'm going to give some more thought to my space where I do my deep work. Maybe I should paint the office or make it a bit of a nicer place to be. I tend to not sit in the home office because I prefer to sit out on the kitchen table where I'm surrounded by other people, which is not good for distraction-free work, but I just like to be around people, so maybe it's a case of making my office a bit more cozy. And I think those are it. So I guess the overall summary is that deep work, rules for focused success in a distracted world. I found it hard to get into this book, but once I did get into it, particularly the second half, there were a few really interesting thoughts and ideas that are shared in here. It's quite long. Took me longer than most books to read, but if you struggle with focus and you're really looking for some practical ideas and some stories to inspire you from other people who have been able to really achieve some amazing things by the way that they manage their work, in particular to make time for deep work, then I'd say this book is for you. I think already, like I mentioned, I'm only a couple of pages into this one, Essentialism. This is already going to be more of the book for me. I am, 2 pages into chapter 1 after reading it. It doesn't actually have an intro, does it? So I'm 4 pages in then, and I'm loving it already. So stay tuned. I will come back to you, tell you all about Essentialism, maybe next week, if not the week after, but not far away. Hope you enjoyed, hope you found that helpful. I'd love to hear what you thought about deep work, or if you go and read it, then come back and tell me what you think. See you next time.